The Amber Mack Show on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.
Welcome to the Amber Mack Show. I'm super excited about this week's episode because we have part one of a conversation with Godfather of AI, Geoffrey Hinton, who's going to explain how AI works and tell us which AI predictions he got wrong.
That's great. I'm really looking forward to that chat. But speaking of getting things wrong, we're also going to talk about Meta's really bad week, why the internet is overrun with bots, how Rivian might be coming to an Uber near you, and some great Canadian news about quantum. So let's get to this week's headlines.
Newsfeed.
Well, we talked last week about how the relaunched Dig had to temporarily close down because of an onslaught of bots. Now, Matthew Price, the CEO of Cloudflare, which is used by 1/5 of all websites on the internet, has explained how that could happen during an interview at South by Southwest, predicting that AI bot traffic will exceed human traffic by 2027.
What's really fascinating about his estimate of bot traffic before generative AI was roughly 20% of internet traffic. So that is a five-fold or more increase over the next couple of years. He partly explained the rise by noting that if a human wants to buy something online, they might go and explore just a handful of websites. Whereas when an AI bot is tasked with buying something online, it might go to thousands and thousands of different websites. And what's worse, he's not sure that the current internet infrastructure is really going to be able to handle all of that strain.
Yeah, and that's a pretty big issue. He talked a bit about how during COVID, when everyone was streaming all the time out of nowhere, that there were definitely some creaks in the internet there. So we'll see what happens with that. And you can hear more about that and more in a great video on the South by Southwest account on YouTube called The Internet After Search. So definitely worth taking a watch. Also makes me vaguely terrified to see what's going to happen in the US midterms relative to AI bots as well, including, increasingly convincing deepfakes that we see all around us and lots of other things that I think will be playing a role in that election. So that's a little bit terrifying. But yeah, we can leave that for another day. In any case, while the bots are definitely taking over the internet, robot cars are making some big inroads. Pun definitely intended as well. In fact, Uber has just announced that it is investing $1.25 billion into the electric vehicle maker Rivian with an aim to get 50,000 robotaxis on the road in the next 5 years.
I'm such a huge fan of Rivian. They are such good-looking cars. I'm starting to see more and more of them around Toronto. So let's talk a little bit about that expansion. It's going to start in Miami and San Francisco in 2028, so not too far away. And by 2031, plans are to have them in a couple dozen cities in the US, Europe, and yes, even here in Canada, assuming that regulatory approval comes through. I have not yet had the opportunity to try a driverless car, but I think it's kind of inevitable. I was in a city recently where they did have them, and I decided I didn't want to do it. I wasn't going to. How do you feel about them?
Yeah, I'd want to be doing it in pretty controlled circumstances. I think, driving around in a city slowly sounds better than cruising along the highway or something like that. But we'll see. I think we're all gonna not have a lot of options in that in the far future. But for now, I think I might stick to driving my own car.
For sure. And that is not all of the robot news that we have, as Amazon recently acquired Swiss robotics company River with the aim to use its four-legged wheeled robots for Amazon doorstep deliveries after investing $1 billion in River back in 2022. And Jeff, I was looking at River and some of these delivery robots, and I went down a huge rabbit hole. There are so many videos, and they are so futuristic looking. I mean, it is exciting, but a little bit scary as well.
Well, and I think there's the current human delivery experience could definitely use some improvements. I'm sure we've all experienced this where you get people, we've got a covered front deck, and yet we'll have Amazon leave packages on the steps out in the rain on the front deck instead of putting it somewhere covered or things like that. So I think that last mile of delivery has definitely not been perfected by Amazon yet, and you see all sorts of different ways that I think that could be better. For one, ring my freaking doorbell when you drop off a package so I know it's there. It just seems crazy that that nobody actually knocks on your door or does anything to let you know it's there. But anyway, we'll see. So those robots that could definitely help things. It is, I think, at this point just to get from the truck to the house. So that's not going to keep them from parking the wrong way on the street and blocking off driveways like I see them doing all the time. But hopefully, it'll fix some of the shortcomings for the last few steps getting on to your doorstep. And jumping back to Canada, Université de Montréal professor Gilles Brassard has won the Turing Award, which is pretty much the highest honor you can get in computer science. So that's pretty cool. He shares this with an American collaborator, Charles Bennett, for foundational work in quantum information science. And part of this is the BB84 protocol that makes it impossible for a third party, regardless of the level of technology or computing power that the third party has, to eavesdrop on a private conversation between two other users. So there's some real potential there in the future to have that as a pretty powerful. Basically, once that third person comes on, the connection would be broken. So it's really neat. It's really weird, like a lot of quantum stuff. But that day is coming for sure.
And Canada has lots of great expertise in quantum science. And as you were speaking, I remembered a video from someone who maybe you're not the biggest fan of his, but if you remember former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau explaining quantum computing in one of those viral videos many, many years ago. So Canada has always been ahead when it comes to quantum, right? And
Yeah.
that was a great video. I don't know if you were
And same with the AI stuff. Lots of that started in Canada. Actually, the University of Toronto is definitely one of the places where a lot of the AI stuff came out of back in the day. So I hope, as I've said before, Canada needs to do more than just create these things. We need to be able to bring them to market. And what we tend to do these days, and for ages, is we invent things and then we sell them to American companies. And so we really don't get the benefit of having the the entire sort of process happening in Canada. And that's something that we're going to have to fix, given our relationship with the states, I'd say.
For sure. And also just a little reminder that we have Geoffrey Hinton coming up on this episode a little bit later on, who, of course, has done a lot of his work at the University of Toronto and is one of the godfathers of AI. So you're exactly right. When it comes to AI research, Canada has many of the leading researchers here at home. Now, let's move over to AI in the visual arts. Adobe is updating its Firefly image generator with a new custom modes feature that lets you provide reference images with your own branded assets in order to train a model that will replicate your style in newly generated AI images. So, Jeff, you're going to have to break this down. I know what this means, but people might be a little overwhelmed with what exactly that means for them.
Yeah, so uh, the sort of business case of it is around branded assets. So basically, if you have a bunch of visuals that you use in campaigns and to represent your company, then you can load them into this AI and have that AI take inspiration from them and basically try to replicate the style of the imagery and colors and things like that. And it's really pretty cool, and it's been a big missing piece for AI visual content, because one of the things that's hard to get with it, as we've seen and talked about with AI video, is the continuity. So you could do this. This wouldn't just have to be a business. You could do it for your own art stuff if you're trying to uh, create a bunch of assets for a book or for something else. You could use it there. But I think it'll be especially compelling for businesses. And even though it's definitely going to replace some human effort, it also helps, I think, keep human artists in the loop, at least when establishing the look and feel for a brand or campaign. And that's important. And that can, as we've seen with everything AI, you really need to give it the right inspiration to get great results. So, I would take that as a positive if I were a visual artist. And just sticking with AI, the Trump administration has recently issued a legislative framework to try to create a single policy across all of the United States when it comes to the rules of AI.
We've talked a lot on the show about AI rules, and we've discussed how it makes more sense at the federal level than the state level, of course. But the issue, I think, is still that the federal administration is really so hard to trust right now in terms of doing the right thing. That said, there are points about, and I'm quoting here, empowering parents and guardians with robust tools to manage their children's privacy settings, screen time, content exposure, and account controls. But there is also a lot of language here, Jeff, that really seems designed to get regulations out of the way of US AI dominance. There is a real AI race happening around the world right now. Regardless, the intention seems to be that Congress should play a role in getting the details right, but that the White House wants it turned into law this year. So there is a ton of work to be done on this front.
Absolutely. And they don't, those the points about kids and stuff, that's great. There's certainly no mention that I remember seeing in it about age limits or anything like that. And so we'll see. Maybe that's part of what they're talking about in terms of details that Congress could work out. But it's not just Congress. And speaking of, there's a lot of work to be done. Uh, there are points relating to intellectual property that involve the courts, and so some some of those are going to, that's not going to be in anyone's control how long that takes. There's some uncomfortable framing around intellectual property too, like, and I quote, although the administration believes that training of AI models on copyrighted material does not violate copyright laws, it acknowledges arguments to the contrary exist and therefore supports allowing the courts to resolve this issue. So that's not going to happen fast. But also, I mean, how does it make any sense that AI companies illegally scraping and incorporating copyrighted content into their models, how is it that that doesn't violate copyright laws? Like, I don't know what your argument against that is. Maybe you'd like it not to, but it certainly does. They get that content illegally. They're not paying for it, and they're not allowed to use it in these ways, as far as I think most legal experts think. So yeah, there's a lot more than that to be critical of, but let's hope that bipartisan efforts in Congress can make this more useful than it might appear at first glance.
Yeah, we'll keep an eye on that, as well as just want to mention what's happening here in Canada on the AI regulation side. There are lots of discussions about age gating social media, for example, and some AI rules. I think I'm a little bit optimistic, Jeff, that something may happen in Canada over the next few months. We will see, but it feels like we are definitely pointing in that direction. And if I can just say, I heard that Minister Solomon recently said during an event, he's the Minister of AI, we've had him on the show, that we can no longer have AI in the hands of just the tech bros and benefiting them. It has to benefit the country at large. And I do want to say that I have not heard him ever say that really to the extent he just did.
Well, that's encouraging, and I mean, you know, v the ideal way to do this is that you would create the regulations to drive the evolution of AI, and we're kinda cart behind the in front of the horse here a little bit, so any movement on that is good, but, we've seen what happened when we left social media regulation to social media companies. Surprise, surprise, they completely abused the the place that they the role that they play in our society, and tons of harms coming from that. So, we have to learn from those social media failures when we're going into the AI age for sure.
And I think all the time that it was 10 years ago that I wrote a book about online safety. So these rules and regulations have been a long time coming. Now, there was a lot of movement last week on the Meta front, including relative to Horizon Worlds, which the company said would stop being supported on their Quest virtual reality headsets by June 15th of this year, even though Meta had positioned Horizon Worlds as an essential piece of its VR efforts, only to then have Meta CTO post late last week that we have decided just today, in fact, that we will keep Horizon Worlds working in VR. I'm not sure this inspires a lot of confidence in Meta's decision-making process.
No, I don't think so, and, whoever it was, TechCrunch or whoever I read an article about on this was like, "Oh, well, that news will make the 6 people who use it very happy," because, yeah, the uptake has not been anywhere close to what Mark Zuckerberg was hoping for, and, I mean, we've mentioned it before, the Reality Labs division in charge of Zuckerberg's metaverse has lost $73 billion since 2021, which, as TechCrunch points out in that article, is an amount that would require you to spend $1 million every single day for 200 years to accumulate. So, an enormous amount of money to do pretty much nothing. So, nice to know that even though it was all for naught, that Zuckerberg still gets to enjoy his billionaire lifestyle, still has ironclad control of Meta, even though what I would say is probably his only truly original idea over all of his time at the head of Meta has obviously become a complete failure that they've had to abandon. So, if you're rich enough, there's not really much in the way of just desserts for when you screw things up, and the metaverse definitely was a huge expensive screw up, and these announcements have affected Meta's stock price and other things. So maybe the markets will wake up to that, but I'm not super optimistic about that at this point.
And whatever you do after the show, for people listening, do not look up photos of Mark Zuckerberg's yacht, because this will make you run right to the bathroom and vomit. It is so large and obnoxious. So I am with you. We should also note that Meta is apparently delaying its next AI model for a couple of months, because even after Meta spent billions on AI hires, it just can't compete with other leading AI models. And this may lead them to temporarily licensing Google's Gemini. Jeff, just before you commented this, I want to say that I just saw a documentary called The AI Doc, and they were able to interview most of the big tech leaders in charge of these models. Even Sam Altman was in the documentary, but the two that didn't show up, Mark Zuckerberg declined, and Elon Musk said he would participate, but then kind of backed out because he was busy. And I feel like that's pretty telling about where those guys are.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Yeah, again, Zuckerberg, I don't even understand how he got into that club, but, you go to Harvard, I guess. Anyway, even so, and, in fairness, look at what's happened with, Apple relative to their AI. They're gonna go with Google's Gemini, and they have a bunch of delayed products now that I'm sure Tim Cook was anxiously planning to get out for their 50th anniversary on April 1st, but that's not gonna happen because of series shortcomings. So, at least it shows that Google's Gemini is something that the heavyweights trust in. So maybe we'll get better services. But even so, Meta has also said it's going to cut back on using third-party vendors to manage its content enforcement on its social media site, and instead will use its own AI systems to do most of this work. So I don't know how those two things fit together, because if they're Meta's own AI systems, it seems they're not very good if they're having to resort to Gemini. So we'll see when the details come out on this a little bit more. But Meta also announced they'll be launching, and boy, we'll both be so relieved for this, because we know and have talked about how hard it is to get help trying to do business stuff on Meta platforms. But don't worry, Amber, they're going to be launching a Meta AI assistant to help with support on Facebook and Instagram, which currently we both know is a total joke. And I'm not very optimistic that a Meta AI assistant is going to make it any better, but at least you may be able to get through to somebody, which you can't even do nowadays. But anyway, quite the announcements to pair with Meta's, basically our AI is so bad, we have to get a new one from Google. Coming up next, though, we've got a good AI story. We've got part one of our two-part conversation with Geoffrey Hinton, also known as the Godfather of AI, who discusses how AI is shaping the future of work and why he's switching away from ChatGPT. So stay tuned, that's up next.
The Amber Mack Show on Canada Talks, Sirius XM 167.
The Royal Canadian Institute for Science recently announced that the Nobel laureate Professor Geoffrey Hinton, widely regarded as the godfather of artificial intelligence, has been named the recipient of the Sanford Fleming Medal, Canada's most prestigious award recognizing excellence in science communication. Amber sat down with Professor Hinton at RCIScience's award ceremony to talk about everything from AI warfare to the AI predictions that he got wrong. Here's their conversation.
AI Spotlight.
I was lucky enough to meet you back in 2019 at an event. We did have a conversation in 2019 about AI warfare. And I'm just going to read a quote. You said, "I think it's quite scary. Autonomous weapons are just about here." And you really kind of started raising alarms before a lot of people were speaking about some of these threats.
Not well. There was someone called Stuart Russell who was raising alarms well before that. So I was a fairly latecomer to AI safety. Many of my colleagues have been thinking about it for more than 10 years. I was lucky in that people paid attention to what I said, but I was a latecomer to it.
So when you think about what's happening today in 2026, when it comes to AI safety, I mean, clearly you have many of these concerns, but many of us are actually seeing this play out in the reality in front of us today.
Yes, so very recently, for example, we've seen that one of the big tech companies actually did have some moral principles, and sort of fairly mild moral principles. They didn't want their AI being used for mass surveillance of Americans, just of Americans as far as I can tell. And they also didn't want it being used for weapons that decided by themselves to kill people, which seems sort of, it's hard to argue with that. The Defense Department, that nice man, Peter Hegseth, wanted to be able to use them however they liked. And Anthropic said no. And so they've now gone after Anthropic. OpenAI, I think on the Thursday, OpenAI said they stood with Anthropic, and on the Friday, they took their business. So I've now stopped using ChatGPT. I love ChatGPT, but I'm moving over to Claude because Sam Altman's moral flexibility is a bit too much for me.
I think there's a lot of people in the room who would probably agree with that statement tonight as well. I wanted to also chat with you a little bit about some predictions that you have made, because for many of us who have followed you for a long time and listened to your predictions about the future, there is one that you brought up during our conversation before we were sitting down today, and you said you wanted to talk about it, a prediction that you made back in 2016 that we will not need radiologists within 5 years.
Yes. I was just giving a lecture in one of the hospitals. I wasn't thinking that it was going to a worldwide public. And AI had got much better at interpreting what was in images. It was getting better rapidly. And it seemed to me obvious that just for interpreting medical images, AI would be better than people in about 5 years. That was over-enthusiastic. It's about comparable with people at many images now, better than people at some images, quite a few in fact. But what happened was, instead of AI just replacing people at the interpretation of images, people now work with AIs. They have many, many different AI systems that have been approved for image interpretation. And I think there's a lot more image interpretation going on. So there were 2 things I got wrong. Actually, there were 3 things I got wrong. One, I got the timescale wrong by about a factor of 2, maybe 3. If you're, factor of 2 or 3, physicists don't worry about things like that. So I also got the conservativeness of the medical profession wrong. It's hard to overstate how conservative they are. So, for example, if AI were to kill somebody by failing to diagnose a cancer, they'd think that was terrible. If a few hundred people die because they didn't use AI to diagnose the cancer, they ignore that. That doesn't count. So I think it's a very asymmetrical decisions they're making. They should think about people who are dying because they're not using AI. Then the third thing I got wrong was that healthcare is an elastic market. So in many markets, when you get AI to do things as well as people or better than people, people will lose their jobs. But in healthcare, we could absorb endless amounts of it, particularly when we're old. I could use 10 full-time doctors just myself. But when we get AI, we'll get a lot more healthcare. And so I don't think it'll put people out of work. If you made doctors 10 times more efficient, we'd just all get 10 times more healthcare, and that'd be great. So you have to decide whether the market's elastic or not.
I'm glad that you're mentioning this because I do want to talk again about some of the threats, but this is one of the places where you had mentioned in our call before we had this conversation, seeing it as an elastic market where you do see some incredible advantages when it comes to AI. You mentioned that oftentimes doctors are a little bit conservative. We need this technology in healthcare in Canada right now to close some of these gaps. How quickly do you think we'll be able to embrace AI in those settings?
I think quite a lot of it depends on politics. There's one case I heard about recently where a company developed a system that you take a photograph with your iPhone or your Android, and you give it to their system, and it tells you whether that blotch on your skin is a melanoma or whatever. It tells you what it is. And it's as good people at doing that. And so it can act as a front end to decide whether you should go to a dermatologist. It can also be used in hospitals. The company is dissolved now. It's in limbo with debts because they couldn't get it used in Ontario because the Ontario government wouldn't make a health code for it. So hospitals wouldn't buy it because there's no way they could charge $3 to $5 for using it to look at something and say what it was. So there's quite a lot of that goes on, I think.
Kind of discouraging, really, at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Do you see any other markets that are elastic where you see opportunities with AI?
Yes, education. So we can all do with more education. I could do with learning some physics. It's slightly embarrassing that I don't know much. So in education, I think it's going to be great. It's slowy. It's not really good at being a tutor yet. It's getting there, though.
Let's talk a little bit more about that because I think there are probably people in the room who think about AI and education and they see the headlines of AI has been banned in schools, kids aren't allowed to use AI. So can you expand a little bit on that?
So what we know is that if you have a private tutor, you learn about twice as fast as learning in a classroom. Because quite a lot of what goes on in the classroom is a teacher in broadcast mode. The teacher is telling, you don't have one-to-one, you can't afford it, right? So a teacher is teaching 20 kids in a private school or 35 kids in a state school. And what the children are hearing is the answers to questions that they didn't just ask. Now, when I interact with a chatbot, as soon as I'm curious about something, I ask it, and it tells me, and I absorb the information because that's what I wanted to know. And a lot more education should be like that. It should be people following their curiosity. And teachers can't do that. Teachers can do that in one, and it's very effective. But there aren't enough teachers to go around. But there will be enough AIs to go around. So I think we'll find education, particularly for kids like me who have slight ADHD. If people are talking about something I'm not interested in, I find it very hard to attend. And I think AIs will make education much more efficient. It's going to be a while before they're really good at understanding what it is that the pupil is misunderstanding.
Am I correct when you said AI today, when in the context of education, did you say slowy? Is that the word that you used? Slowy, that it's slow, we're not there yet in terms
It's not quite there yet. It doesn't really understand fully what the pupil doesn't understand. But in the end, it will, because it'll have had a lot of training data.
So what do you say when people say that when kids use AI or students use AI, they're cheating? What would be your reaction to that?
When students use pocket calculators, they're cheating.
It's a fair comment.
I mean, the future is going to be people working with AIs. So what teachers ought to be examining is how well the student can get something done with AI. At least for the next few years, things are going to be like that. It may be a bit later on, AI is just going to take over. But for the next few years, it'll be people working with AI. And so that's what's going to be how people are going to be employed. That's what they ought to be examining.
It's interesting. It really brings me to the next question because one of the things that people will often ask me about AI is it going to take my job? I mean, it's a pretty straightforward question, but is really top of mind for a lot of Canadians. What would you say to that?
Yes.
Great. can just wrap up right now.
So my belief is, and the belief of most of the experts, is that sometime within the next 20 years, we'll get general purpose artificial intelligence that can do pretty much any intellectual job people do. Anything you do on a computer, it's going to be able to do better than a person. And things like interviewing people about something, it's going to be able to do that just fine.
Jeff, that's a little personal. That's my livelihood over here.
Well, my livelihood used to be sort of coming up with scientific ideas and programming. That's all gone.
So, I mean, what should people do when that's the answer?
I don't know.
All right. It's a fair comment. I wanted to ask you just in terms of the definition of AI. I watched this incredible podcast interview that you did with Jon Stewart. It was about 90 minutes long, very in-depth, and he asked some really brilliant questions. And I've always wondered, in terms of the definition of what is AI? How does it work? We don't have 90 minutes, but can you kind of just give people in the room a primer from your perspective?
Do we have 80 minutes?
Maybe 20.
How about 15?
Okay, 15. Go for it.
Okay. I will do my best. So your brain has a lot of brain cells in it, neurons. And you learn to do things. And the question is, how do you learn to do things? How do you learn to make a network of brain cells perform some tricky task like, for example, taking an image and saying whether it contains a bird or not? And so roughly speaking, and this is grossly simplified, but this is the rough idea, you have layers of these brain cells. Neuroscientists call those different cortical areas. In artificial neural nets, we call them layers. And the early layers for doing vision detect little combinations of bright pixels. So a pixel is a little piece of a digital image. And the first stage when you're recognizing objects just detects whether there's little pieces of edge at particular locations in the image. You might think you could take the pixels, so each pixel has a brightness, and that's what goes into the computer, the brightness of each pixel. You might think you could connect those directly to other neurons that say whether there's a bird there. So suppose you have a very bright pixel. Should that say there's a bird, or should it say there's not a bird? Well, the problem is that there's white birds and there's black birds. If all birds were white and everything else was black, when you get a bright pixel, you should say that makes it more likely there's a bird there. But birds can be white or black. So the brightness of a pixel doesn't really tell you much about whether there's a bird. But the brightness of a pixel can tell you about whether there's a little piece of edge there. If you imagine a row of, I need to wave my right hand. I'm in danger of waving them. That won't work. No. So imagine a little row of pixels like this. Sorry, a little column of pixels like this, and a little column of pixels next to it like this. If all of these are bright and all of these are dim, then you've got an edge there. And you can make a brain cell that detects that, a neuron that detects that. It can have big positive connection strengths coming from the 3 pixels here, and big negative connection strengths coming from there. So if these are bright and these are bright, it gets positive input from here, and it gets negative input from there, and they cancel out and nothing happens. But if these are bright, it gets positive input from there. And if these ones which would have given it negative input are dim, it doesn't get any input from there because they're dim. And so it gets very excited and it says, hey, there's an edge here. So it's quite easy to see how you could wire up a brain cell to detect a little piece of edge in the image. And so that's a good start. We have these neurons that look all over the image, lots and lots of neurons, gazillions of them, detecting little bits of edge in different positions and different orientations, and also at different scales, because you can have a big fuzzy edge of a cloud, for example. That's the first layer. The next layer is now going to find little combinations of edges. So you might, for example, have a brain cell that looks for 3 edges like this and this and this, and 3 more edges like this and this and this. And if it sees these 3 edges and these 3 edges all active, it says, hey, I found what I like. And it does that by having big positive connection strengths coming from these 3 neurons that detect those 3 edges and these 3 neurons that detect those 3 edges. When it sees that combination, it says, hey, I found what I liked. And obviously what it likes is a potential beak. It could be lots of other things. It could be an arrowhead. It could be all sorts of things. But it's a candidate for a beak. And you might have something else in that layer that detects a little circle of edges. That's a candidate for an eye. Then the next layer up, you might have something that looks at a beak. It finds that there's a beak somewhere, and it finds in the right relative location there's an eye. So maybe there's a sort of beak here and there's an eye here, and a neuron in the layer higher up sees the beak and it sees the eye, and it says, hey, there might be a bird's head there. And so now you can see how I might make a neuron that would detect a bird's head. You'd need many different neurons for different shapes of bird's head and so on. And then at the very next layer up, maybe you've got bored by now, so you hook those things up, things that detect a bird's head or the talons of a bird or the wing of a bird. You hook them all up to a neuron that says, if I find a bunch of those things, I'll say there's a bird there. Okay, so I just hand designed a little neural net that would be okay at detecting birds and images if I was very patient and made lots and lots of these detectors. Little detectors for edge in the first layer, detects for little combinations of edge in the next layer, detects for combinations of the next layer, and finally an object detector. Now the real system's got more layers than that, but that gives you a sort of rough idea how it works. And you can see how you might wire it all up by hand, but that would take much too long. So here's another thing you could do. You could start with your layers, and you could put in random weights. Instead of saying, for my edge detector, I want 3 big positive weights coming from these 3 and 3 big negative weights from these 3, and then I'll be able to detect an edge that's brighter here than there. I'll just put in random weights, small positive and negative numbers. And so my neural net will just sort of do random things. It won't do anything sensible. And I'll have these layers, and it'll have some output for bird, an output for cat, an output for dog, and so on. And when I put in an image of a bird, it'll say, well, it's a little bit of bird, and it's a little bit of cat, and it's a little bit of dog. And I could ask the following question. Could I change the strengths of just one of the connections in the network so that when I put in that particular bird, it's a little bit more sure it's a bird and a little bit less sure it's a cat? So I could go around fiddling with all the connection strengths, and I could change the connection strength to say, what did that do to whether it thinks it's a bird? And if I had astronomical time, if I had billions of years, I could fiddle with each connection strength, see if it made it more likely to get the right answer. And if I make a change and it gets more likely to get the right answer, I keep that change. If I make a change and it gets less likely to get the right answer, I probably make the opposite change. That's a kind of mutation method. That's a bit like random evolution. It would work in the end, but it would take forever because these networks have billions and billions of these connection strengths, and you have to change each connection strength many times, and you have to show it a lot of images to know whether increasing the weight or decreasing the weight, that's the strength of the connection, helps or hurts. So that would take forever. Do I have 5 more minutes?
Please. Oh my goodness. I would never cut you off.
Okay. So, in that case, I got 80 minutes.
Oh boy.
So, what I've shown you is what a network might look like for detecting a bird, and how you might get an evolutionary approach to build that network, starting from random weights and just changing the weights by making little random changes and seeing if they help. And if you go on like forever, that'll work, but it'll take much too long. What you'd like to do is put in an image of a bird. It'll say it's sort of 10% a bird, 10% a cat, 10% a dog. And you want it to say 11% a bird and 9% a cat. And what you'd like to know is there a way of figuring out for every single weight in the network, all 100 billion weights, whether I should increase them a little bit or decrease them a little bit to make it work better? And there is a way of doing that. It's called backpropagation. It was invented by many different people. A colleague of mine invented it in San Diego in 1981, and we did a lot of work on it and showed that it really worked very well. And the way it works is you look at the difference between what you got, which is 10% it was a bird, and what you wanted, which was 100% it was a bird. And you take that difference and think of that difference as a piece of elastic. So think of the output as a height. 10% is a bird, and you want it to be 100% as a bird. So think of a little piece of elastic attaching the 10% to the 100%. And that's trying to pull the 10% up. But the 10% can't move because you put in the image of the bird, and the weights determined the activations of all the feature detectors in all the layers, and that determined that it was 10% a bird. And to make the 10% move, you'd have to change the weights. So you take this piece of elastic that would like to pull the 10% up to 100%, and you say, what if I took the force pulling, transmitted it backwards through the network to the weights that go into that bird unit? So if I want it to go up, and there's a weight going into the bird decision unit, and it's coming from a highly active neuron, I know that if I made that weight a bit stronger, the 10% will go up to 11%. So when I take this force pulling it upwards, I can transmit that back to the weights, and it'll change the weights so as to make it more likely to say bird. But it'll also do something else. I can transmit the force backwards not just to the weights coming into the bird unit, I can transmit it back to the feature detectors in the layer before. Remember, we had a feature detector that detected the head of a bird. Well, suppose it is saying sort of, maybe there's a head of a bird. And you want it to be, and it is a bird, and you want the bird output to be stronger. Well, if you made that feature detector more active, it would be more confident it was a bird. So we transmit this force from the elastic back through the connection to the activity of this feature detector for the head of a bird and say, you should be more active. And that's like a piece of elastic pulling on that feature detector. So we can take the elastic pulling on the outputs and convert it into a piece of elastic pulling on the feature detectors. And that solved the fundamental problem of neural networks, which is, how do you decide for all these neurons in the intermediate layers whether they should be more active or less active? Well, you do it by taking the forces pulling on the output, transmitting them backwards, and seeing how they pull on these intermediate feature detectors. That's called backpropagation. Now, if you still did calculus in grade 13 in Ontario, you'd know that this was the chain rule of differentiation. But unfortunately, you have to go to university to learn that. But that's how these things learn.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that. Great explanation. I know, I feel like that does deserve a round of applause. Have a sip of water. So this kind of brings me to my next question then. Let's talk about chatbots, because I think a lot of people, probably one of their first interactions with using any type of AI tool was probably a chatbot after ChatGPT became so popular in 2022. So when we think about chatbots, some people may think, well, chatbots, they can think. They have a mind of their own. What would you say to that?
Yes. I'll try and justify that now.
No, it's okay. Go for it.
Okay. No, I'll say what the opposition says. The opposition says, no, they're not really thinking. They're just using some dumb statistical trick, and they're just predicting the next word, and they make all sorts of mistakes. They're not really thinking. Well, I loved watching Yuval Harari when he was asked about this, saying, well, what am I doing? When I talk, I'm just predicting the next word. I'm just figuring out what word to say next. And once I've said that, I can figure out the word to say after that. So if you think about a device for predicting what word someone says next, you can make it pretty good by just using correlations between words. Like you can store a whole bunch of little phrases like fish and chips. And if you see fish and, you can predict chips. That's how autocomplete used to work on a computer in the early days. And that's what many people think is still happening, but it's nothing like that anymore. It's much more sophisticated. It's much more like we generate words. So what happens is, if you want to predict the next word really well, you have to understand what's said. I mean, if I ask you a question and you're going to compose an answer, I ask the question, and then the first word of the answer, you have to have understood the question to get the right first word, right? You can't just produce it by using pairwise statistics between words or storing phrases, because you might never have heard that question before. So by forcing the neural net to be very good at predicting the next word, what you're really doing is forcing it to understand. And the way it understands is the same as the way we understand. What it does is it takes the words in the context, it converts each word into a big bunch of features. Like the word cat will be converted into a huge number of features like has whiskers, is a pet, is somewhat aloof, requires constant attention when it's hungry. Many, many features. That's the meaning of cat. It's all those features being active. So what your neural net has to learn to do is convert words into these sets of features that capture their meaning, and then have the meanings of the various words in the context interact with each other to predict the features of the next word. And once you predict the features of the next word, you can make a good guess about what the next word is. That's a very simple version of how these large language models work. I made a very simple version in 1985 like that. And these large language models I think of as just much bigger versions of the thing I had in 1985 that had like 1,000 weights in it. They now have 1 trillion weights. That's like 1 billion times bigger. Yes, that's a lot. But basically, they convert words into features. The features interact to predict the features of the next word, and then they can predict the next word pretty well. They don't actually use words. They use little fragments of words. But that's essentially how it works. And I want to give you an analogy for this to give you a bit more insight into how all these words interact. So the question is, what does it mean to understand a sentence? So in the good old days of AI, in the last century, people thought that understanding a sentence meant translating it into some unambiguous logical language. So I can give you a sentence that has ambiguities in it, and you can translate it into something that doesn't have ambiguities. In English, for example, if I say, the trophy would not fit in the suitcase because it was too big, the it at the end there is next to suitcase, right? It would not fit in the suitcase because it was too big. But it doesn't refer to suitcase, it refers to trophy. And you understand that because you know the meanings of words. You know that big things can't fit inside little things. If I said, the trophy will not fit in the suitcase because it was too small, you'd assume the it refers to suitcase. And you do all this without even noticing it. So the point is the it is ambiguous and you have to clean it up. You have to decide, does it refer to the suitcase or does it refer to the trophy? Now, the question is, what's going on in your mind and what's going on in these big neural nets when they hear a sentence like that? And you can think of it like this. Each word is going to get converted into features, but that's going to happen in multiple layers. So initially, a word gets converted into some set of features, which maybe aren't quite its meaning, but are roughly its meaning. For prepositions, or pronouns, or whatever they are, like it, they're very vague features. They don't know which thing it refers to begin with. As you go through the layers, you disambiguate it, so you'll know whether the it refers to trophy or suitcase. But that'll depend on your common sense knowledge about big things fitting in, not fitting inside small things. So it's quite a complicated process. And to try and give you a picture of it, I think what people have done, I mean, start from being apes. What do we have that apes don't have? Well, one of the main things we have is language, and it's good for thinking with. And I think language is kind of a universal modeling tool. So linguists on the whole focus on syntax. They don't know how to think about meaning because they didn't have the right mechanism for capturing meaning. But language is like a kind of modeling kit for modeling anything you like. So let's start off with a very simple kind of modeling kit. If I want to model the distribution of matter in 3D, I can use Lego blocks. So if I dream up a shape for a car, I dream up a sort of brilliant shape, like it's sort of sheets of flat metal that are sort of sloping, and I'll call it a Cybertruck. And I want to show you what shape a Cybertruck's meant to be. I can make it out of Lego blocks. The surface won't be quite right, but I can say where the stuff is with Lego blocks. So Lego blocks can model any 3D shape moderately well. They don't get the fine details right, but they can say where the stuff is. Well, words are like Lego blocks, except they can model anything at all, not just 3D shapes. They can model your intentions, what you want somebody else to do, what happened, what's going on inside a star. You can model anything with words. So the way they differ from Lego blocks is, first of all, there's many more of them. You typically use about 30,000 different words. Second, they're high dimensional. So as I said, the meaning of a word is a whole bunch of features. Maybe it's got thousands of features. That means it's a 1,000-dimensional thing. So the activation levels of all these features tell you what the word means. So for cat, for example, has whiskers is high, and for fridge, hopefully, has whiskers is low. I've seen fridges where that's not true, but so that's the meaning of the word. It's much more complicated than the shape of a Lego block. So that's the second difference. There's lots of different words. Each one is a high dimensional thing. What's more, the shapes aren't rigid. So if I give you a word, an unambiguous word, it's got an approximate shape. That is, approximate activation of the features. But its exact shape is going to be determined by the context. Lego blocks aren't flexible. They don't fit in with their context. They're just there. Words deform to fit their context. So you get different shades of meaning of a word depending on the context. So that's a third difference. And then the question is how they fit together. Lego blocks fit together with little plastic pegs that go into little plastic holes. That's very simple. Words fit together in a more complicated way. And there's something called a transformer, which underlies all of these large language models. And I'm going to try and give you a very approximate model of how a transformer makes words fit together. It's not quite right, but it's the best I can do that's easily visualizable. So think of a word as having a shape, and the shape's a bit flexible. And on this word, there's lots of long, flexible arms. And at the end of each arm, there's a hand. And the hand can change shape. But it only changes shape when we change the shape of the word. So as you change the shape of the words, all the hands on the ends of its long, flexible arms all change shape together in a way that depends on what word it is. Okay. Now, also on words, there's a whole bunch of gloves. They're stuck on the words with their fingertips stuck to the word and the open end of the glove sticking out. And they also change shapes as the shape of the word changes. And what you have to do to understand a sentence is take the initial shape for each word, the approximate meaning of that word, and then deform it so that its hands change shape and its gloves change shape in such a way that the hands of other words can fit in the gloves of this word and vice versa. So they have to sort of shake hands. It's not exactly shaking hands. Hands have to fit into gloves. One little extra detail is that hands and gloves come in different colors. There's red ones and yellow ones and blue ones, and red hands can only go in red gloves and yellow hands can only go in yellow gloves. That's just a detail. That's called multi-head attention. So to understand a sentence, what you have to do is take the initial approximate meanings of the words and then start deforming them as you go through the layers of the neural net. Each layer is deforming them so that the hands of some words can fit into the gloves of other words. This isn't exactly right, but it'll give you a rough idea of what's going on. Now, there's something else we know that's a bit like that, and that's folding a protein. So understanding a sentence is actually much more like folding a protein than it is like translating a sentence from one language to another language, some special internal language. You take your approximate meanings for the words, you deform them so it all fits together nicely. Once it's all fitted together nicely, you've understood the sentence. That's what understanding is, and that's what linguists had no clue about.
Thanks to RCIScience for sharing this conversation with us for the show. We'll share part 2 of Amber's sit-down chat with Professor Hinton on next week's show, so stay tuned for that. And coming up, we share some of your feedback from last week's episode.
You're listening to The Amber Mac Show on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.
Before we wrap up today's episode, I just wanted to remind everyone that you can check out the show over on YouTube. We're growing our community there, and we want to include a couple of recent comments. So from last week's interview with tech journalist David Pogue about his new book on Apple's first 50 years, Philip Shane, who appeared on the show, Elmo guy, totally awesome dude, shared this, quote, "I've had something Apple in front of me or in my hands or in my pocket every day since 1983. Apple products and software have enabled my whole creative career and so much more. Excited to get the book." End quote.
And also, we had a comment on last week's news about Anthropic's battle with the U.S. government. Sean Nelson shared this, quote, "I praise Anthropic and pray the industry moves to make local AI models like Web AI our industry standard. Our government's behavior towards Anthropic is a huge red flag indication on the direction of where they want to take our society and treat us as people, end quote. So keep those comments coming. You can check out our segments over on YouTube at AmberMac. Thank you so much for listening to the show on SiriusXM or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you next week.
You're listening to The Amber Mac Show on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.